Okay, Reddit. I don't even know how to start this without sounding like a total mess, but here it goes. This all started a few weeks ago, and I still feel the cold aftershock of it every time I walk into that office. I've been at my company for almost 3 years now, enough time to know the ropes, but apparently not enough to survive my boss without getting humiliated. So, let me set the stage. My boss, let's call him Mark, has always had this presence, arrogant, self assured, like he invented business itself. I mean, the guy struts into the room like he's the final word on every decision that ever existed, and honestly, half the time I think he enjoys watching people flinch. He has this signature icy glance that seems to pierce right through you, like he's calculating all your weaknesses and daring you to try and prove him wrong. The trouble started when my team was assigned a new project, one of those high stakes deals that could make or break a quarter. I had ideas, big ideas, ideas I knew could actually help us succeed. But apparently, my boss didn't see it that way. We had a team meeting, the kind where the room is quiet, everyone's pretending not to breathe too loud, waiting for Mark to drop the first bomb. He looked around at each of us like a hawk surveying prey, and then he landed on me. That cold, measured stare that made my stomach twist. He didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Don't get involved in this project," he said. Just like that. Flat. No smile, no hesitation. "Your incompetence will ruin the company. This is men's work." Yes, he actually said that. Out loud. In front of the entire team. My heart stopped for a second. I blinked. I nodded. Silently. Because if I'd opened my mouth, I probably would have sputtered some embarrassing mix of anger and tears, and honestly, that would have been exactly the humiliation he wanted. But inside, Reddit, I was boiling. Rage, shame, frustration, doubt. It all collided in this messy storm of feelings. I could feel every colleague's eyes on me, some sympathetic, some curious, and some, I swear, enjoying the show. I kept thinking, what does he even understand? This project could be my chance to finally prove myself. My ideas could make this work. But hearing him say it out loud, dismissing me so completely, made me second guess everything. Was I really out of my depth? Had I just been imagining my competence all this time? After the meeting, the whispers started. You know the kind. That low, almost conspiratorial murmur that fills the office when something juicy happens. Some colleagues nodded in agreement with Mark, like, yeah, she's probably not ready. Others shot me looks that were hard to read. Pity? Surprise? Confusion? Maybe a mix of all three. Either way, it left me exposed, vulnerable, humiliated in a way that wasn't overt. Just this quiet, insidious undermining that gnawed at me. And the worst part? Mark didn't just stop at the words. His presence after that meeting changed. He started hovering more in meetings, cutting me off, asking loaded questions I wasn't prepared for. The guy who previously ignored me unless he needed a report suddenly acted like I was a ticking liability he had to monitor. I could feel his judgment in every interaction. Every casual question was laced with an unspoken, "Are you really capable? Or will you fail spectacularly?" It didn't help that the office has this culture where mistakes are punished silently but ruthlessly. One wrong email, one misstep, and you become that person everyone whispers about. I'd always thought I could handle that. I thought I was careful, meticulous, strategic. But under Mark's gaze, I felt like a beginner, like a child who didn't belong in the boardroom. Later that day, I replayed the meeting in my head 1,000 times. I analyzed my words, my tone, the slight tremor in my hand when I took notes. Every time, I hated myself a little more for not standing up, not arguing, not proving him wrong. And yet, there was this spark, something stubborn, something in me that refused to believe he was right. Because the thing is, Reddit, I knew I had ideas that could work. I knew the project had potential, and more importantly, I knew I could handle it. Mark didn't know me. He didn't know the late nights I put in studying industry trends. He didn't know how much I cared, how much I craved responsibility. And for the first time, I realized maybe that was my advantage. He underestimated me. So yeah, that's where it started. That icy glance, that condescending dismissal, that subtle but complete undermining. I didn't react. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. At least, not yet. I just walked out of that meeting, clenched my jaw, and silently promised myself, if this project fails, it won't be because I didn't try. And if it succeeds, maybe, just maybe, he'll regret ever looking at me that way. But little did I know, the humiliation was only beginning. Mark's arrogance was like a storm, and I was about to get caught right in the eye of it. And Reddit, things got messy, fast. Okay, so things got chaotic. Like, how is this even happening? Chaotic. 2 days after that meeting, the office went completely sideways. I mean, I thought Mark was bad at reading people, but apparently he's also bad at forecasting reality. Which, honestly, should have been my warning sign. He's arrogant, but he's also reckless. Dangerous combination. It started in the morning, phones ringing off the hook, emails flooding in like tidal waves, clients screaming, "What happened? Where's our update? Is this going to affect the deal?" The usual minor hiccups turned into full-blown panic mode, and Mark was pacing, clutching papers in both hands, muttering under his breath like some kind of deranged conductor. His signature icy gaze was gone, replaced with raw panic. I watched him through the glass walls of his office, and honestly, part of me felt a flicker of, I don't know, satisfaction? I didn't want him to fail, exactly, but I couldn't help noticing that the guy who declared me incompetent was suddenly drowning in the chaos he clearly didn't see coming. And then, the news hit. A major contract, the one this project hinged on, had collapsed. Just like that. Clients pulled out, negotiations fell apart, and within hours, the market reacted. Our stock plummeted, colleagues panicked, and everyone in the office was either running down corridors or hiding behind screens. At that moment, I realized something terrifying and exhilarating. This was my chance. My big, stupid, stressful, chaotic chance to prove I wasn't the failure Mark insisted I was. So I did what I do best. I started scanning every number, every contract, every tiny detail of our business. I pulled up spreadsheets, cross-referenced agreements, compared our proposals against competitors. Every click, every calculation felt like a mini victory against the creeping panic. But the office wasn't exactly cooperative. Some colleagues huddled in corners whispering, others gave me wary glances, and a few openly tried to dodge any responsibility. Classic. Mark, meanwhile, was flailing. He barked orders at random people, contradicting himself mid-sentence, completely oblivious to the fact that no one was really listening anymore. I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear he tried to hide behind that arrogant facade. And here's the kicker. Despite everything, he had the audacity to look at me like I should follow his instructions. Like, no, dude, you're the disaster. And then the most humiliating thing happened. During a team check-in, he called me over, trying to assign me a task, except he didn't even know what the task was. He literally handed me a stack of disorganized documents and muttered, "Figure this out. Make sense of it." No guidance, no context, just, "Go, human calculator. Save me." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Mostly, I just wanted to punch a wall. So I did what any sane person would do. I quietly sat down, organized the documents, and started connecting dots no one else could see. And slowly, so slowly, it became clear where the problems were, why the contract fell apart, and what steps could reverse the damage. I scribbled notes, highlighted critical points, and drafted emails that would hopefully stabilize the situation. But here's the office twist you need to understand. In the middle of all this chaos, everyone becomes either an ally or a saboteur. And you can't always tell which is which. Phones kept ringing, people kept yelling, printers jammed at the worst possible moments, and someone even spilled coffee on a crucial report. It was like the universe decided to test me personally. I won't lie, I panicked too. There were moments I stared at my screen, chest tight, thinking, I can't do this. I'm going to fail, and everyone will see Mark was right. My hands shook while typing urgent emails. My eyes burned from staring at numbers, contracts, and endless reports. My head throbbed from the tension, but something inside me refused to break. That spark I mentioned before? It flared into this insane, stubborn determination. I couldn't let Mark, or the chaos, win. By lunchtime, I had a small team rallying behind me. Not everyone, but a few people started taking instructions seriously, and I realized something important. Leadership isn't about the title or the ego, it's about action. You act when everyone else freezes. You move when everyone panics. And if you do it right, you survive. Or maybe even win. Meanwhile, Mark? He hovered, stared at my screens, murmured to himself. Occasionally tried to interrupt with suggestions, which were mostly irrelevant and condescending. I had to bite my tongue more than once. I wanted to tell him, sit down, breathe, and watch someone competent work for once. But I didn't. I just focused, kept moving. By the end of that day, we had stopped the bleeding. Sort of. Contracts were being patched, clients cautiously responding, and the office was slightly less of a madhouse. I sat at my desk, exhausted, fingers stiff from typing, eyes sore, but feeling this weird mix of pride and dread. Pride because I had survived, dread because I knew this was just the beginning. Mark had lost some control, but he hadn't lost his arrogance. Not yet. And that, Reddit, was going to make things interesting. So yeah, first signs of disaster? Check. Humiliation? Everywhere. Panic? Absolutely. But underneath it all, I realized something terrifyingly motivating. I might be the only one who could actually save this project. And if I could, if I survived Mark's constant undermining and the office chaos, maybe, just maybe, I could finally prove that he, and everyone else, was wrong about me. Okay, Reddit. So this is where things started to get really surreal. After the chaos of the first 2 days, I was expecting Mark to double down, to blame everyone, maybe even call some emergency meeting to yell at me in front of the team. That would have been the predictable route. But instead, he did something completely uncharacteristic. Something I still can't fully wrap my head around. He admitted he was wrong. Yes, you read that right. The guy who called me incompetent dismissed my ideas in front of the whole team and made me feel like a literal liability. He came to me with an apology. It was the next morning. I was already knee-deep in spreadsheets, emails, and frantic calls, trying to salvage what was left of the crumbling contract. My phone buzzed. A calendar notification popped up. Meeting with Mark, 10 minutes. My stomach sank. The last thing I wanted was a lecture, a condescending pep talk, or, God forbid, public humiliation. I walked into his office, expecting tension, maybe even mockery. Instead, I found him pacing like a trapped animal, papers in disarray on his desk, hair slightly messy, and for the first time, his icy gaze was gone, replaced by something else. Panic? Anxiety? Embarrassment? I I was wrong, he said, not looking at me directly. His voice was low, hesitant, almost defeated. Please, take control of the project. I froze for a second. My brain refused to process it. This was the same man who told me, flat out, that my incompetence would ruin the company. The same man who made a point to publicly humiliate me. And now he's asking me to lead? I blinked, swallowed the sudden lump in my throat, and kept my tone calm. Too calm, maybe. You know, mistakes are costly, I said carefully, but now is exactly the moment to show who is truly capable of saving the company. His eyes flicked up, darting nervously across my face. For a split second, I thought I saw relief. Then he smoothed his expression into something closer to his usual arrogant composure. Not entirely successful. Inside me, excitement mixed with quiet anger, motivation, and honestly, a little vindictive thrill. After all, this was my chance, not just to rescue a sinking project, but to prove, loudly, undeniably, that I was capable, that he had no right to underestimate me. So I dove in, head first. I started reviewing every document, every contract, every detail of the negotiations that had failed. Numbers, deadlines, proposals. I absorbed them like a sponge. Every late-night spreadsheet, every carefully crafted email, every tense phone call became part of this whirlwind that I now controlled. The office noticed the change immediately. Some colleagues were cautiously optimistic, others openly skeptical, whispering to each other about whether I could actually pull it off. And Mark? He hovered, occasionally offering advice that was vague at best, irrelevant at worst. And each time, I held my ground. Calm, polite, but completely in charge. I learned very quickly that the moment I let him feel needed, he'd start trying to assert dominance again, and I wasn't going to let that happen. But Reddit. Here's the thing. Admitting he was wrong didn't erase the humiliation. I still remembered that meeting. The whispers. The icy glance. The way the team had collectively held its breath while he dismissed me. Every time Mark spoke, even now, as he begged me to take the reins, I could feel the shadow of that humiliation hanging over me. It was like carrying a phantom scar, invisible to others, but very real to me. And that shadow fueled me. Anger, shame, determination. They became this strange cocktail that pushed me to work harder. I spent 16-hour days dissecting everything that had gone wrong, looking for patterns, identifying weak spots, and devising strategies. I started noticing things no one else did. Minor contractual loopholes, client concerns that were being ignored, internal inefficiencies. The project was a mess, yes, but I was starting to see a path through the chaos. Mark tried a few times to intervene, suggesting improvements to my approach. Usually he phrased it like a suggestion, but the tone clearly implied, "This is your chance to fail." I'd just nod, smile, and then quietly explain why his suggestion wouldn't work. Not sarcastically, not angrily, just calmly. And each time I saw that flicker in his eyes, the same flicker he used to make me doubt myself. But now, it was hesitation, uncertainty, recognition that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have all the answers. There were small victories almost immediately. Contracts that had been lost started to stabilize. Clients who were about to pull out entirely responded positively to my outreach. And the team, slowly, cautiously, started to respect the direction I was setting. It was subtle, but it was there. And through all this, I couldn't ignore the weird mixture of emotions that bubbled up. Satisfaction, relief, vindication, but also lingering embarrassment and doubt. It's hard to feel like a hero when your story starts with public humiliation and a boss who literally told the team you were incapable. I wanted to savor the win, but a tiny part of me kept bracing for the next insult. But Reddit, Here's the takeaway from this insane day. Sometimes people will admit they were wrong. Sometimes the arrogant ones will come crawling back when their ego and incompetence collide. And sometimes that admission is your ticket, your chance to take control, prove yourself, and start turning humiliation into power. Mark's words didn't erase the past, but they opened the door. And I stepped through it, ready to fight, not just for the project, but for myself. The storm wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the wheel. All right, Reddit, buckle up, because this chapter of my life feels like it lasted a month in 1 week. After Mark admitted he was wrong, and yes, I still can't believe he did, I was officially in charge, and I took that responsibility seriously. Maybe too seriously. The first thing I realized was that the project wasn't just a mess, it was a nightmare. Contracts scattered like puzzle pieces, outdated financial forecasts, client concerns buried under mountains of ignored emails, and a team that was, well, let's just say some people were more interested in gossip than strategy. Every single detail screamed chaos, and I knew that if I didn't dive in headfirst, this thing would spiral out of control again. I started by dissecting every single contract. Numbers, clauses, deadlines, penalty fees, incentives, everything. I created spreadsheets that probably looked like alien code to anyone else, cross-referencing timelines, revenue projections, and risk factors. For hours, I stared at these numbers until they made sense in my head. Some of the older contracts had inconsistencies that could have sunk us completely if ignored, and suddenly it felt like I was uncovering landmines no one had bothered to see. And then, there were the people. Colleagues who had quietly mocked me when Mark publicly humiliated me now had to follow my lead. That was satisfying, I'll admit, but also terrifying. Because while I had authority on paper, real influence required convincing them to trust me, and some were resistant. There were whispered arguments behind closed doors, subtle sabotage in emails, and one guy who accidentally deleted a critical report right before a client call. I knew it wasn't an accident, and I knew exactly who it was. But I couldn't react impulsively. Not yet. Mark, of course, hovered. He would pop his head in with a casual thought or idea, often framed as helpful, but really just designed to test me or make me second-guess myself. Like the time he suggested we renegotiate a contract with one of our biggest clients based on a completely wrong assumption about market trends. I smiled, nodded, and gently explained why his idea would have tanked the deal. I could see the flicker in his eyes, the same flicker he used to intimidate me. Only now, it was fear. The real breakthrough came when I started connecting dots no one else could see. Minor contractual issues, client concerns, internal inefficiencies, it all formed this big chaotic puzzle. I drafted contingency plans, organized priorities, and reallocated resources. I spent 16-hour days at my desk, fueled by coffee, frustration, and the quiet, stubborn determination not to let Mark or anyone else define my capability. And the office? It was like a live wire. Phones ringing constantly, clients demanding answers, printers jamming, someone spilling coffee on a critical report. Literally everything that could go wrong did. But oddly enough, I thrived in that chaos. I became this sort of anchor, the calm in the storm. People came to me for answers, instructions, and sometimes just reassurance that things were under control. Me. The same person Mark had called incompetent just days before. There were moments I wanted to scream. I'll admit it. Late at night, staring at spreadsheets, I questioned myself. Am I really capable? What if I miss something? But I couldn't let the panic in. I had to model confidence, even when everything inside me screamed otherwise. And Reddit. That's exhausting. mentally, physically, emotionally, but somehow I kept going. By the end of the week, small victories started showing up. Clients responded positively to follow-ups. Some contracts that were teetering on the edge of collapse started stabilizing. My team, well, most of them, were beginning to recognize that this wasn't luck. It was strategy, planning, and sheer determination. And through all of it, Mark watched, sometimes silently, sometimes offering faintly critical suggestions, but nothing that could derail me. One sudden moment sticks out. Midday, a client called, furious because they hadn't received a critical update. Their contract was on the line. I grabbed the call, calmly navigated their anger, and negotiated a revised timeline that satisfied everyone. When I hung up, my chest was pounding, but my colleagues stared at me like I'd just performed magic. And honestly, that's how it felt. Like I was the only person in the room who saw the threads connecting the chaos and knew how to pull them into order. But here's the kicker. Even with progress, humiliation lingered. Every time I looked at Mark, I remembered the icy stare, the condescending words, the way he publicly dismissed me, and I realized something. That humiliation wasn't just a memory, it was fuel. It reminded me why I had to succeed, why I had to prove not just competence, but resilience, that I wouldn't let anyone define my worth, especially someone who had already underestimated me so completely. By the end of that week, I was exhausted, bruised by stress, but undeniably in control. The project was far from finished, but the momentum had shifted. Mark could no longer act as the intimidating, all-powerful figure. He had to watch. And for the first time, I felt something deliciously dangerous, the power of being underestimated and being right. If I thought taking control of the project meant things would calm down, I was dead wrong. Once the initial chaos had passed, a new kind of storm appeared. This one fueled not by market crashes, but by people. Colleagues who couldn't accept that I was now in charge started showing their true colors, and it was subtle at first. Small oversights, delayed reports, dismissive nods in meetings, tiny things that could be written off as mistakes. But I started noticing patterns. It became clear quickly that some people were actively undermining me. Emails deliberately misdirected, key numbers altered in shared spreadsheets, whisper campaigns questioning my decisions. One of the junior analysts even forgot to send a critical update to a client. Another accidentally deleted part of a report I'd been working on for hours. Every little sabotage felt like a personal attack, and honestly, it was exhausting just keeping track of all the tricks being played. Mark, of course, noticed, but instead of intervening, he hovered with that same arrogant, calculating gaze, probably hoping I'd fail. It was infuriating. Sometimes he'd pop into my office, casually suggesting changes or pointing out tiny errors, pretending to be helpful. I learned to smile politely and explain why his suggestions wouldn't work, which was satisfying, but it didn't erase the tension in the air. One particularly memorable incident involved a client call that was supposed to finalize a key contract. Just minutes before I was about to dial, one of the friendly colleagues accidentally, or not, sent me the wrong attachment, a completely outdated version of the proposal. I felt my heart leap into my throat. There was no time to panic. I took a deep breath, quickly corrected the numbers, and somehow managed to walk through the call without the client noticing. My hands were shaking, my pulse was racing, but I got the deal back on track. Meanwhile, whispers and side conversations became constant. I started overhearing phrases like, "she's out of her depth," and "maybe she won't last the week." It was like a chorus of doubt and malice surrounding me, and at first, it stung. I couldn't ignore it, but slowly I began to use it as motivation. Every small act of sabotage became a puzzle to solve, a test of endurance. I began anticipating their moves, double-checking reports, preempting potential mistakes, and keeping an eye on every minor detail. Then there were the subtle power plays. One colleague kept questioning my decisions during meetings, framing their challenges as concerns, but clearly trying to make me second-guess myself in front of others. I had to learn to respond with calm authority, explaining my reasoning without letting frustration slip into my voice. Each confrontation was a small battle, but over time, I noticed a shift. My team began to respect my composure, even the skeptics. At the same time, I discovered that a few unexpected allies were quietly helping behind the scenes. Some people who initially stayed neutral or skeptical started sending me notes, clarifying issues, and double-checking contracts. They didn't announce their support. It was subtle, quiet, almost invisible, but it made a huge difference. By the end of the week, I realized that navigating the project wasn't just about numbers or strategy. It was about human behavior, about understanding fears, ambitions, and grudges. Every call, every email, every decision required constant vigilance. One misstep, and someone would try to take advantage of it. The office had become a chessboard, and I was learning how to anticipate moves, set traps, and protect my position. Even with these victories, I couldn't ignore the toll. Sleep became scarce, stress constant. Some days I left the office feeling drained, exhausted from not just the work itself, but the constant undercurrent of distrust and sabotage. But with each small success, the deals that went through, the reports that were finally corrected, the team starting to follow my lead, I felt something building inside me. A confidence that was no longer fragile, no longer tentative. I was learning how to survive in a system designed to trip me up. Mark's presence remained looming, but it had changed. He could no longer dismiss me outright. He would watch, make veiled criticisms, and occasionally try to assert control, but I had learned to meet his arrogance with calm, measured responses. He realized that his words no longer carried the same weight, and for the first time, I felt that balance of power shifting. Enemies were everywhere. Intrigue was constant, and the office was a minefield. But I had started to find my rhythm, turning every attack, every whisper, every deliberate mistake into an opportunity to prove myself. And slowly, painfully, I was learning that surviving the project meant more than saving the company. It meant claiming my space, my authority, and refusing to be defined by the arrogance or hostility of others. After surviving the sabotage and subtle attacks, it became clear that I couldn't just react anymore. I had to take control, fully and aggressively. The project wasn't just failing because of old contracts or careless mistakes. It was failing because no one had a plan that accounted for everything. And apparently, Mark had no intention of providing one, so I had to create it myself. The first step was a complete review of every contract, expense report, and pending negotiation. I spent hours cross-checking numbers, flagging inconsistencies, and predicting where clients might pull back. It felt like playing 3D chess blindfolded. Some colleagues watched, skeptical. Others quietly helped, but most didn't say a word, probably assuming I would crash. That silence, while nerve-wracking, gave me freedom to work my way. Next came the strategy meetings. I had to present a plan not only for internal approval, but also for clients and stakeholders who were losing patience. Mark tried to sit in on every session, making suggestions that were really attempts to reassert control. At first, I let him talk. I nodded politely. Then, when his ideas conflicted with the plan, I calmly explained the reasoning behind every decision. He frowned, shifted papers, muttered, but eventually stayed quiet. For the first time, he wasn't leading. He was just observing. Negotiations became my battlefield. Some clients were furious, threatening to leave entirely. I spent long hours on calls, walking them through revised schedules, clarifying misunderstandings, and offering realistic solutions without overpromising. One particularly tense call involved a client screaming about missed deadlines, and my stomach dropped as I realized one of our reports had been mistakenly sent incomplete. I had no choice but to improvise, explain the error without admitting panic, and promise a corrective action plan within hours. When the call ended, I was shaking, but the client agreed to continue. Internal processes also needed urgent attention. I identified redundant workflows, conflicting responsibilities, and gaps that had allowed errors to accumulate. I restructured the team assignments, giving tasks to those who could be trusted and putting safeguards around sensitive work. Some resisted, but I reminded them, firmly but politely, that this was not optional. The project's survival depended on accountability, not politics. Late nights became routine. I was constantly monitoring emails, client feedback, and internal progress. Coffee became my lifeline, and exhaustion my constant companion. But there was a strange satisfaction in finally connecting all the dots. Each completed task, each corrected mistake, and each client reassurance felt like slowly tightening a net around chaos, transforming it into control. Mark continued to hover. Sometimes he would try to claim credit subtly, mentioning ideas I had already implemented in meetings, phrasing them as improvements he had suggested. It was infuriating, but I had learned to document everything. Every email, every proposal, every suggestion I made was time-stamped and clearly mine. I didn't confront him yet. I had bigger battles to fight, but I was prepared for when the time came. Meanwhile, the team began to shift. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, people started respecting the structure I had imposed. The ones who tried to sabotage before now either complied or kept their opposition private. I noticed this subtle change and felt a surge of vindication. It wasn't public, dramatic, or flashy, but it was real. I was gaining authority without shouting, without dramatics, without proving myself to Mark in front of everyone. One sudden crisis reminded me why vigilance was necessary. A critical client called, threatening to pull out over what seemed like a minor contractual misunderstanding. When I investigated, I discovered that a colleague had altered a key clause to test me to see if I would notice. I immediately corrected it, contacted the client, and presented a revised, accurate document. Within the hour, the client was reassured and stayed on board. That was when I realized that the project was more than numbers. It was human weaknesses, egos, fears, and ambitions, all interacting in unpredictable ways. By the end of the week, my rescue strategy was taking shape. Contracts were stabilized, workflows streamlined, and client relationships cautiously improving. Mark still tried to insert himself, but I had learned to handle him calmly, methodically. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was leading. And that, more than any completed contract or satisfied client, gave me a sense of power I hadn't felt since the beginning of this nightmare. After weeks of late nights, constant problem solving, and navigating sabotage, I finally started seeing the first signs that the project might actually survive. It wasn't dramatic at first, just small victories, but after the chaos of the past weeks, every little win felt monumental. The first major success came when a client who had been on the verge of pulling out agreed to extend their contract. It wasn't just luck. I had gone through every email, every document, anticipating every question they might ask. During the call, they tested me hard, pushing deadlines, questioning numbers, even hinting that our internal disorganization was a deal breaker. I stayed calm, walked them through the revised plan, and answered every challenge with precision. When I hung up, my hands were shaking from adrenaline, but the client had committed. Another success was internal. My team started to function like a machine rather than a battlefield. Those who had been resistant began following the systems I put in place. Reports were submitted on time, data accuracy improved, and, most importantly, communication started working again. I even caught a few people quietly helping each other to meet deadlines, which was a subtle but satisfying shift. It was proof that leadership didn't require yelling or intimidation. It required consistency, vision, and resilience. Mark, of course, watched everything. He tried to interject on a few decisions, suggesting changes that made no sense, but I had learned to respond politely and firmly. One time, he said, "Maybe we should revisit the numbers on this deal." I calmly explained why the numbers were accurate and why any deviation could jeopardize progress. His frown was subtle but noticeable, and I knew he realized his usual authority no longer applied. It was a strange feeling, knowing I had more credibility with the team and the clients than the man who had spent weeks humiliating me. The momentum began to build. Contracts that had been hanging by a thread stabilized. Clients started responding faster, returning calls, and expressing tentative trust. Internally, my team had fewer arguments and more solutions. For the first time, I could step back for a moment and see the bigger picture. The chaos was becoming manageable. The project was no longer teetering on the edge. It had a foundation. I won't lie, though. This period was exhausting. I worked 16-hour days, constantly monitoring emails, checking updates, and anticipating problems before they appeared. I rarely left my desk before the office emptied, and when I did, I felt drained to the bone. But the exhaustion was tempered by a sense of satisfaction I hadn't expected. It was addictive, in a way. The rush of turning potential disaster into controlled success. One sudden event stood out. A competitor unexpectedly announced a move that could have undermined one of our key deals. While everyone panicked, I quickly analyzed the situation, proposed a counter-strategy to the client, and preemptively mitigated the risk. Within hours, the client expressed relief and renewed confidence in our company. The team looked at me in a new way, like I was someone who could not just survive chaos, but anticipate it. Even Mark's attitude shifted slightly. He no longer hovered as aggressively. Sometimes he offered subtle hints that he was proud, or maybe just relieved, that things were improving. I didn't care whether it was pride or relief. The point was, his constant arrogance no longer intimidated me. The power balance was tilting. I had gained credibility through results, and that was something no ego could dismiss. Despite the progress, I kept my guard up. I knew that success often provokes envy, sabotage, or attempts to steal credit. I documented everything meticulously: emails, proposals, client approvals, so there would be no question about who had achieved what. Slowly, the office environment began to shift. Suspicious glances became fewer, whispers grew quieter, and cooperation, however tentative, started to replace hostility. The combination of client wins, internal efficiency, and team trust created a sense of momentum that felt almost tangible. The project wasn't just surviving anymore, it was moving forward. And in that movement, I began to feel something I hadn't since the very first humiliating meeting with Mark. Confidence. Not arrogant confidence, but quiet, grounded certainty. I was capable. I had turned the chaos into progress. I had made the project mine. By the end of that month, the office atmosphere had subtly changed. People started consulting me before acting, clients responded promptly, and even those who had doubted me before were visibly adjusting to the fact that I was in control. It wasn't a dramatic triumph, not yet, but it was the first undeniable evidence that persistence, preparation, and calm determination could overcome even deliberate undermining and arrogance. Just when I thought things were finally stabilizing, Mark decided to remind me that he wasn't done trying to assert control. I'd been leading the project for weeks, building momentum, gaining client trust, and navigating office sabotage. But suddenly, he started inserting himself into decisions. Subtle at first, almost polite, but unmistakably testing boundaries. It started with a meeting about one of our largest clients. I presented the plan, step by step, anticipating questions and objections. Mark sat back, nodded, then casually suggested a minor adjustment that, if implemented, would have completely undermined the strategy I had worked so hard to build. I paused, smiled, and calmly said, "The project is under my control now. Any changes must come from me." The room went quiet. Colleagues exchanged glances. A few tried not to smile. I could feel the tension, but I didn't flinch. This was the first real test of my authority, not over the numbers, not over the chaos, but over the perception of my power. Mark's eyes narrowed, a subtle flicker of frustration crossing his face. He wanted to challenge me in front of everyone to prove that he still had the upper hand. I refused to give it to him. From that moment, the office became a minefield of subtle tests. Mark would drop vague suggestions in passing, expecting me to hesitate or stumble. He would casually point out potential issues in front of the team, framing them as concerns, but clearly designed to make me second-guess myself. At first, I felt the old panic rising. My heart would race, my stomach would twist. But I learned to breathe, to respond with calm confidence. Each response was firm, polite, and measured. No yelling, no theatrics, no defensiveness. The real challenge, however, came outside of meetings. Emails arrived with conflicting instructions, deadlines were shifted without notice, and one colleague even misfiled critical documents. I realized that Mark wasn't just testing me in public. He was trying to destabilize me quietly, to make me appear incompetent through indirect sabotage. I had to anticipate every move, double-check every report, and document everything meticulously. One particularly tense moment stands out. A key client emailed, confused about an internal update. I traced the confusion back to Mark's last-minute suggestion, which had been miscommunicated by one of the team. I had only an hour to fix it before the client would make a decision that could cost us the contract. My pulse raced, hands shaking slightly as I drafted a clear, precise explanation, reassured the client, and corrected the workflow internally. When the client responded positively, relief washed over me, but I also knew this was exactly the kind of situation Mark had been hoping to exploit. I started noticing something else. The team's reaction to my handling of these moments. Some colleagues began to quietly support me, providing updates before I even asked, flagging potential issues, and even subtly shielding me from miscommunications. Others, however, tested boundaries themselves, influenced by Mark's subtle manipulations. I had to navigate between encouraging the allies and curbing the disruptive influences without appearing authoritarian. Every interaction became a small psychological battle. Late nights were now standard. I reviewed every contract, every client communication, and every internal process before leaving. The stress was constant, but a strange sense of satisfaction began to develop. I wasn't just managing a project anymore. I was learning to protect it, to shield it from interference, and to assert authority in an environment where arrogance and manipulation were daily hazards. By the end of that week, I realized that this personal test wasn't about Mark anymore. It was about me. Could I maintain composure under pressure? Could I assert control without losing credibility? Could I navigate a minefield of sabotage, office politics, and arrogant interference without breaking? The answer, painfully and slowly, was yes. The experience left me exhausted but stronger. I knew that the office would continue to throw challenges my way, and that Mark would always test me, subtly or overtly. But I had discovered an important truth. Authority isn't given. It's claimed, maintained, and defended with calm, consistent action. and from now on, I wasn't going to back down. The weeks of constant vigilance, late nights, and office warfare were about to pay off, or so I hoped. The project had stabilized, but the real test came when everything could fall apart with a single misstep. And of course, the universe, and Mark, decided that this was the perfect moment to push the limits. It started with a client announcement that blindsided the industry. One of our competitors launched a product that could have undercut several of our contracts. Immediately, panic rippled through the office. Phones rang incessantly, urgent emails piled up, and the team looked at me, eyes wide, expecting a miracle. My stomach tightened, but I had been here before. Chaos was my landscape now. I called an emergency strategy meeting. Everyone was tense, some borderline panicked. Mark hovered at the edge, offering vague suggestions, trying to appear authoritative. I ignored him. The project was mine. I laid out a clear plan to mitigate the competitor's impact, reorganizing resources, accelerating client negotiations, and highlighting our unique value propositions. Every word, every step, had to be precise. One misstep, and we could lose not just the project, but credibility with every client. Suddenly, a report flagged an internal discrepancy. Someone had altered key numbers in one of the contracts. My heart leapt. Was this sabotage or a simple mistake? I quickly traced the error and realized it was deliberate, a last-ditch effort to destabilize us. I corrected it immediately and informed the client before they could notice. That single move took every ounce of focus and nerve I had. My hands shook, adrenaline surged, but I kept my voice steady when explaining the adjustment. Throughout the week, I closed several high-stakes deals that had been hanging by a thread. Negotiations were intense. Clients challenged every assumption, questioned timelines, and demanded guarantees. I stayed calm, answering every challenge, reassuring every concern, and presenting solutions before problems fully materialized. The feeling was surreal. I was conducting a symphony in the middle of a storm, every decision critical, every second a test. Mark tried to intervene multiple times. He suggested minor adjustments, improvements that would have undermined weeks of careful planning. I calmly declined each one, explaining why they would have jeopardized the project. His arrogance was still intact, but it had lost its edge. The team began to see that my decisions weren't just competent, they were necessary. Authority isn't claimed by yelling or intimidation, it's earned through results. And I was delivering them, consistently, under pressure that would have broken anyone else. The adrenaline of the final negotiations was almost physical. One client, on the verge of leaving, tested me relentlessly, referencing past mistakes and past chaos. I stayed calm, walked them through the corrective measures, and highlighted the stability we had now achieved. When they agreed to continue, relief flooded me. But there was no time to celebrate. The office was still a whirlwind of activity, each client interaction a potential crisis. By the end of the week, the project was profitable for the first time in months. Every contract had been secured or improved, internal workflows were finally synchronized, and the client portfolio was stable. I could feel the tension in the office release slightly. Colleagues who had doubted me were nodding in respect, subtly acknowledging the results. Even those who had tried to sabotage were quiet, their attempts neutralized by documentation, oversight, and proactive problem-solving. Mark was silent for much of the week. The arrogance was still there, but now it was tempered by uncertainty. He had tried to challenge me at every turn, but every attempt had failed. His words no longer carried weight. For the first time, I could see him as he really was. Not the intimidating figure who had publicly humiliated me, but just a man whose power relied on the fear and doubt of others. And I no longer gave him that. The climax wasn't flashy. There were no dramatic confrontations, no triumphant speeches. It was measured, precise, controlled. The project was alive, thriving, and secure. And in that quiet triumph, I realized something important. Victory isn't always about proving someone wrong, it's about proving yourself right, even when the world doubts you, even when those around you try to tear you down. I stood at my desk that Friday evening, exhausted, adrenaline slowly fading, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. I had navigated chaos, sabotage, and arrogance. I had taken control when everything seemed lost. And I had emerged not just victorious, but unshakable. By the time the project was fully stabilized, the office felt like a completely different place. The chaos that had defined the past months had been replaced by structure, efficiency, and a cautious respect from colleagues who had doubted me at every step. It wasn't dramatic or flashy. It was a quiet, tangible shift. Contracts were secure, workflows were streamlined, and clients were responding promptly. The momentum I had built was no longer fragile. It had become solid. The real victory, however, wasn't in the numbers or the reports. It was in the perception of me. Colleagues who had once whispered about my incompetence now sought my guidance. Skeptics who had subtly tried to sabotage the work were noticeably cautious, aware that their attempts could no longer go unnoticed. Even Mark, who had hovered and undermined me since the very first meeting, now watched silently. His usual arrogance was tempered by the recognition that the project's success wasn't due to his input. I had earned authority the hard way, and it was unmistakable. Clients began sending emails of appreciation. Some mentioned the professionalism, some the responsiveness, and some, in subtle ways, acknowledged that the project had taken a positive turn under my leadership. Each message felt like a small validation, a quiet confirmation that the months of stress, late nights, and constant vigilance had not been in vain. Internally, I noticed the shift as well. Meetings ran smoothly, disputes were fewer, and the team followed procedures without hesitation. The office atmosphere, once tense and volatile, now had a rhythm. People were working, communicating, and collaborating instead of maneuvering or undermining. I realized that the project had become not just successful, but sustainable, because systems had been set in place that no single person, including Mark, could easily disrupt. Even in the final days of stabilization, Mark attempted to reassert himself subtly. He would comment on minor decisions or suggest improvements during meetings, but by this point, I had learned to respond calmly, with evidence and reasoning. His words no longer intimidated or destabilized me, they were just background noise. I could see the realization in his eyes that his attempts to control or claim credit had failed. The arrogance he had used to dominate meetings had no power here. I was in control. There was a personal lesson intertwined with the professional one. This project had been more than numbers, contracts, and deadlines. It had been a test of endurance, resilience, and confidence. I had been publicly underestimated, subtly sabotaged, and constantly challenged, yet I had persisted. I had learned to navigate manipulation, assert authority without aggression, and maintain composure under relentless pressure. In short, I had discovered the strength and capability I had doubted for far too long. I also understood the subtle dynamics of power in an office environment. Authority is not about ego or arrogance, it is about competence, reliability, and the ability to maintain control in chaos. I had earned respect through action, not intimidation. Colleagues who had doubted me now respected the results, and even those who had attempted sabotage learned to tread carefully. By the end of the month, I could step back for the first time and observe the project in its entirety. Contracts were profitable, internal processes were smooth, and the client portfolio was secure. Mark's influence had waned, not through confrontation, but through consistent results and calm, measured authority. The project was a success, and I had become someone whose judgment and capability could no longer be dismissed. Sitting at my desk, I reflected on how far I had come: the stress, the humiliation, the constant tests. All of it had been grueling. Yet through it, I had discovered not just how to survive a hostile environment, but how to thrive in it. I had turned chaos into order, doubt into confidence, and interference into opportunity. Victory was not just about the project. It was about proving to myself that I could navigate any challenge, face arrogance without fear, and assert my own authority. And as I looked around the office, I realized that this lesson, more than any spreadsheet or client win, was the most valuable outcome of all. Looking back on everything that happened, it feels surreal. When Mark first dismissed me with that icy glance, I couldn't have imagined that months later I would be the one holding the project together, navigating crises, and earning the respect of the entire office. That initial humiliation, which had seemed unbearable at the time, became the catalyst for everything I achieved. I've learned that underestimation can be a powerful motivator. Mark's arrogance, his constant interference, and the subtle sabotage from colleagues could have broken me, and for a moment, they almost did. But I realized that my response mattered more than their intentions. I could either crumble under the pressure, internalizing every insult and doubt, or I could use it as fuel. I chose the latter. One of the most important lessons is about authority. It's not about titles, ego, or intimidation. It's about competence, consistency, and resilience. I didn't need to prove myself by arguing or overpowering anyone. I proved myself by delivering results, anticipating problems, and managing chaos with composure. That quiet, earned authority is far more powerful than loud dominance or empty confidence. The emotional journey was intense. There were moments of self-doubt when the sabotage felt overwhelming, moments of anger when Mark tried to claim credit for my ideas, and moments of sheer exhaustion when late nights blurred into early mornings. I felt fear, frustration, and humiliation, but I also discovered resilience, patience, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. The highs were exhilarating: a client win, a team member finally acknowledging my decisions, the project turning a corner after weeks of crisis. Those moments reminded me that perseverance pays off, even in the most hostile environments. I also learned to trust my instincts. I documented everything meticulously, tracked every decision, and anticipated sabotage before it could derail progress. That careful vigilance became a shield, allowing me to navigate office politics and subtle interference without losing control. I realized that in environments filled with ego, fear, and manipulation, foresight and preparation are just as critical as skill or knowledge. Perhaps the hardest lesson was about self-worth. Being publicly dismissed, undermined, and doubted by people I had to rely on was humiliating. Yet through that, I realized that other people's perception doesn't define me. I had to define myself through my actions, not through their approval. And when I finally saw the results, the stabilized project, satisfied clients, and a team that trusted me, I knew I had not only survived, but I had grown stronger. If I could give advice to anyone going through similar situations, it would be this: keep your focus, document everything, anticipate challenges, and never underestimate the power of calm, consistent action. Humiliation and sabotage are painful, but they can also be transformative if you let them teach you resilience and strategy. Authority is earned, not given, and no one can take it from you once you've proven yourself. Looking forward, I don't take victory for granted. The office will always have challenges, and Mark or others might test boundaries again, but I now know I can handle it. I have learned to navigate chaos, maintain composure, and assert authority without aggression. More importantly, I have learned that self-confidence, once earned through action and persistence, is unshakable. As I sit at my desk reflecting on these months, I feel a quiet satisfaction. I've survived humiliation, sabotage, and constant tests. I've grown, strengthened, and claimed authority in a place where arrogance and interference once ruled. And I know, without a doubt, that whatever challenges come next, I have the skill, resilience, and determination to face them and succeed.